here at Bank Street and to be with all of you. So we are going to dive a little deep tonight. I'm going to give you a little context for that, but so I'm the director of Hallways. Hallways, for those of you that aren't familiar with us, we are the prevention arm of the Freedom Institute, and Freedom Institute is a drug and alcohol outpatient treatment center that's located in Midtown Manhattan. We've been serving families, individuals, youth, adults for about 40 years out of that location. And for about 30 of those 40 years, we have had a prevention program that works primarily with the independent schools in New York City. A few years ago, we did a big review of our programming, looking at the field of drug and alcohol prevention and looking at the work we were doing, and we realized a couple of things. One of the things we realized was that some of the work we were doing was in line with best practice and some wasn't. And so we rehauled our program. It went from the Freedom Institute school program to Hallways, because one of the things that we realized is that the very skills, the very approaches that you use to prevent drug and alcohol use with young people are the same things that help prevent a host of other issues. And that approach is really about zeroing in and understanding the reasons why young people engage in different behaviors, and then looking at those risk and protective factors and building them up. So our model now really revolves around assessments, where we go to different schools, we do assessments of different grades, and we find out like what are the main risk factors and protective factors for each of those grades that we need to zero in on in order to prevent behaviors, problem behaviors, and promote thriving behaviors. We also do a lot of consultation around curriculum and health curriculum, because one of the things that we see time and time again in the schools that we work with is many of the health curricula that exist are still very topic-based. So you'll have 3 workshops on STDs, and 3 workshops on bullying, and 3 workshops on and what we know at Hallways is that what we really want to look at are skills and values. We want to help young people with decision-making skills, coping skills, critical thinking skills, and weave in a lot of different topics through those skills. So we are a skill-based prevention program. And this is the many types of services that we offer through that lens, through a strategic prevention framework. Tonight, we're really zeroing in on consent and understanding what that means for us as parents, what that means for a school community. So what I'm going to do tonight with you all is really focus in on setting a foundation first, because one of the things we've also realized in working with many schools throughout New York City is that consent education, consent's the big buzzword, right? Everyone's talking about consent, all the colleges are doing workshops, right? It's a big buzzword, but many of us don't have a foundation for understanding what we need to do effective consent education. What are the principles of that? What does it need to be based on? What do we need to be talking about at home with our children? So we have to really understand consent, and that means we have to understand sexual violence and sexual violence prevention, because that's ultimately where this consent push, right, in different universities and schools is coming from. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that. What is consent? What is sexual violence? What do we need to know in order to effectively do this work and not inadvertently kind of promote the very things that we're looking to prevent? So then I'm going to zero in a bit on consent education, like what are the key themes and key messages, and how does that look different for different age groups? Tonight's primarily geared towards parents of 5th through 8th grade, but I'm going to kind of offer a framework that you can use to talk with children of any age. It's the framework I use to talk with my 3-year-old every day about this. And then I want to give you some tips, some best practices around like what can you do starting tonight, starting tomorrow, what are some of the things that you can do or build on that I'm sure many of you are already doing, and then leave ample time for questions. I will not be able to respond to every scenario, I am sure, and part of my choice and our practice of really focusing on this foundation is that with this framework and foundation, it really helps us to be able to know how to maneuver in lots of different situations. It gives us a grounding. So, does that sound good? All right. Okay, so what is consent? So just, affirmative consent is what's happening now, right? That's what New York state law now is in the universities in New York. Many other states have signed affirmative consent laws that are being enacted in their universities and colleges. And the idea of affirmative consent is really this shift from a no means no way of looking at consent to a yes means yes. Okay, so what that means is that the onus of consent, and this is particularly related to sexual behavior and sex, that the onus is on the person that is initiating the activity, right? Whereas before, the old model of no means no, the onus was on the person that the initiation was happening to, right? The receiver of the initiation. It was on them to say no, to say it clearly, to say it loudly, to fight, to demonstrate no. That's no longer the law. That's no longer the case in affirmative consent. The onus is on the person that's doing the asking to make sure that they are seeing that someone is actively, enthusiastically wanting to do whatever it is. Hold hands, make out, oral sex, intercourse, whatever the sexual activity is, that the onus is on the initiator. This is to focus on preventing perpetration of violence, right? That's the reason that this law has shifted over. I like this little Fry's image from Planned Parenthood that students seem to like too, because it makes it a little bit more succinct. So the principles of affirmative consent, right, are these. Freely given, meaning that you're not under any kind of coercion, any kind of obligation to someone. You can freely and without consequence say yes or no or maybe or change your mind, right? It's freely given. That also gets at power differences. So we know, and we talk with young people a lot, that there cannot be consent between an adult and a child, right? There cannot be consent between a teacher and a student, right? There are certain relationships with inherent power differences where consent cannot be freely given, no matter what, because of that implied power difference. So freely given doesn't include that. It doesn't include any kind of threats or coercion. Reversible. This is a tough one for young people, but reversible meaning consent can be revoked, changed, paused at any time, no matter what, right? That everyone has the right to change their mind, and this is where we'll talk about how, yes, this is coming from a sexual framework, but applies to all ages, because it means with a game of tag, it means with tickling, it means with any kind of activity that both parties have the right to change their mind at any time. Tickling is a big one I think of, especially with my 3-year-old, because he loves being tickled until he doesn't. And sometimes he's laughing, giggling, and saying stop at the same time. It seems to be a common thing with tickling, right? I remember as a kid that I really didn't like being tickled, but I would laugh. My natural physical bodily reaction would be to laugh, but I would be saying stop, right? Because I didn't actually like it. So we have a rule with him where he might want to be tickled for, a couple seconds or something like that, and then the second that he says no or stop, we stop. And we always tell him, of course, the second that you say no or stop or you squirm away, we're done. We don't tickle you if you say no. Of course we don't do that, right? That is a rule in our house, and we talk about it regularly. And he has the right to want to be tickled for a few seconds and then to change his mind. So that's reversible, right? Informed, meaning you are not under the influence, you are sober, you are able to make an informed decision about what you want to do, right? So there's nothing that is compromising your ability to make an informed decision. Enthusiastic, right? So enthusiastic, meaning that we want to encourage young people to not just say yes because they feel pressure, or they're kind of a no turns into a yes, but to really enthusiastically want to do things, enthusiastically agree to whatever it is. And if they're not sure they're enthusiastic, then they can say, I'm not sure, and they can pause and kind of think about it or talk about it, right? So the ideal for consent is not a passive, it's not someone lying there, it's not the absence of no, it's the presence of an enthusiastic yes. And specific, the last part is specific. Specific means consenting to one activity doesn't mean consent to another. So consenting to kissing doesn't mean consent to oral sex. Consent to oral sex doesn't mean consent to intercourse, right? So we can't assume consent because one activity has happened. It also means if someone wanted to engage in an activity, again, whether it's a sexual activity or it's a game of tag or play fighting one day, and then they don't want to the next day, that's okay. We can't assume because we've done something with someone once, whatever it is, that they're up for it again. So that's the idea of specific. It's each time, each activity with someone, with another person. Okay, so that's kind of the overview. And then I want to now talk about why this exists. Why do we have this framework? Why is it the buzzword? Why is it everywhere, right? What's the purpose of this? Because it's certainly been, a lot of people that spend a lot of time thinking about this have kind of come up with this, and we've moved towards this as a culture. So the reason is because of the prevalence of sexual violence. And I want to orient us, because I know that there are many myths about sexual violence in the world, with children, with adults. So what is sexual violence, right? When we talk about that, we can also call it gender-based violence. We're talking about a spectrum of behaviors ranging from harassment and ranging from harassment all the way, online harassment, in-person harassment, all the way up to rape and sexual assault, right? So it's a spectrum of behavior. And what it has in common is that it's gendered. We know that the vast majority of folks that perpetrate violence are men, and the majority of people that its perpetration is against are women, right? It obviously is not always under that paradigm, and anyone who does not kind of subscribe to or viewed as your typical, and I'll talk about this in a minute, falling under the typical identity of masculinity is kind of seen as more vulnerable to it, right? So the main predictor of sexual violence is hypermasculinity. And most men are not perpetrators. Most men are not perpetrators, but most men are silent about the perpetration that other men do, right? So we talk about this, that although most of the violence that happens is perpetrated by men, most men are not perpetrated. But we all are brought up in a culture that allows for sexual violence to happen. It happens very regularly at all ages. We are consulting with schools all the time about cases that happen from young ages, from kindergarten on up, that include unwanted touching, coercion, harassment, right? All the way up to sexual assault. Regularly, we're talking with schools about these cases, so we know that it's happening on a regular basis and that our children are exposed to this. We also know that it's not a random thing, right? Most of the time when this happens, it's planned, and the targets are those that are considered vulnerable, right? In our culture, children are vulnerable in our culture. Women, especially those that have been drinking, are seen as vulnerable in our culture, right? It is a targeted, specific thing. And the peer groups have a big influence. So this is why it's really important for us to think about what are the messages that we can send all of our children, because although 95% of sexual violence is perpetrated by 5% of people on an average college campus, right? It's repeat perpetrators. Although that's the case, the peer group and the response that the community has can either, in that person's mind, either promote that behavior to lead to more acts of violence or deter it. So our children, my son, has a big part in being someone that can either challenge the norms that perpetuate the violence or in turning, a blind eye to it. So I want to talk about the Man Box. I don't know how many of you have seen this at all, but this came from A Call to Men originally, which is an organization that I had the real privilege of working for. And it now is used everywhere, all the time. Anyone that's doing this work in classrooms and with folks that's doing sexual violence prevention work, if they're not starting from looking at gender or socialization, that's a problem. Big problem. Do not work with people that aren't starting with that. That's really the root of what we want to look at. And so we do this all the time in classrooms, right? What does it mean in our culture when someone says, act like a man? What does it mean in our culture when someone says, be a lady? And the kids just flood. They have so much to say about this. And we fill up a box, right? This is not one that was done with young people here, but it has a lot of the same things that young people in the independent school community have to say, right? They recognize the limits and the restrictions of much of our culture's stereotypes about masculinity in terms of their emotional development and their ability to express their emotionality, in terms of feeling like they have to prove that they're tough all the time or at least not weak. There's a lot of pressure on boys, right, to fit in this man box. What we also do when we talk with young people about this box is we fill this box up all over. We do it on the board. It's filled, filled, filled. And then we say, what happens if you step outside the box? In this school, in this community, what happens? And they have a lot of things to say. I was going to bring one of the slides because we take pictures, and I thought I needed to give warning because of some of the language that kids will say. We'll say, what are people called? We need to use real language because this is what the power of the man box is and the policing is, right? If you step outside the box and people say, oh, you're kind of a wimp one day, like that doesn't have as much of an effect as if you step outside the box and someone says something really powerful that shames you, right? So we talk about the potential consequences for this and how this box can really box young men in, and boys in, and anyone who's seen under that identification. And then we do the same for young women, right? And we do this in our consent classes because we have to start with setting a foundation for what makes consent so difficult for us to understand. When we go in and we talk about the idea of affirmative consent, most young people are kind of baffled. That is so unrealistic, right? That's not how it works. Like, we're never gonna ask each other. The purpose of sex is not that. It's not intimacy. It's not connectedness. It's not making sure the other person's happy. It's about getting off, right? It's about the guy getting off. That's what they tell us. And of course they tell us that, because look at the world around us. Look at the movies that we see. Look at the culture that we live in, right? It's saturated with the idea about sex as being a conquest, sex as being something that kind of men have the right to go and get, and girls are supposed to play, a role of wanting it but not too much, and saying no but not meaning it. And so there's all kinds of images, and they'll start to give us lots of examples from the media, Scandal, and they have a ton of examples that they give us. We talk about fairy tales. We talk about Snow White, right? Being, Snow White is asleep and the prince kisses her, she wakes up to a stranger kissing her, and that's romantic, right? And we talk about the fact that actually that's assault, The kids, oh my God, right? We go through a lot of the fairy tales and break them down, and we're pretty horrified to find that most of them are assault, or certainly not consent, right? There are these stereotypes playing out from the time our kids are so young, about men being in charge and bold and taking what's rightfully theirs, and girls being ready to be saved, and that's kind of their purpose, to look pretty and be rescued, right? These stereotypes are so old, and they're still so alive and well in the classroom, sadly, as we see almost every day as we do these workshops. So I want to ground this a little bit in this community, because much of the research that we do at that we look at Hallways, and this is a whole other talk that I'm not going to get too deep into, but I think is important to mention some of, is looking at the research that over the last 15 years has come up around affluence as a risk factor for young people. Because we see over and over again that rates of anxiety, depression, acting out behaviors like petty theft, cheating, that these things are about twice as high in affluent communities as in non-affluent communities. Most of the studies have been done in affluent suburban communities, and what researchers have seen is that it's not coming from an affluent home that's the risk per se, it's being part of the cultural context of affluence. The idea that we have to be, there's these very, very high standards, the work hard, play hard, achievement, the focus being so much in these communities on external markers of success, that what the research shows us is that young people can be very, very developed intellectually and very underdeveloped socially and emotionally, because their sense of self-worth is tied to their sense of their external markers of success, of how well they're doing, what school they're going to get into. We see this play out all the time. Very regularly, we either see or hear from schools like fifth graders crying because they didn't get an A on a test, and this is not good, and this is going to prevent them from getting into an IB in fifth grade. So this is the cultural context that we're in. And the other big piece of this is that the research shows that gender norms within these communities are even more rigid than non-affluent communities, particularly and in very gendered ways. So for girls, and we again see this come up when those boxes when we do them, and we hear it in the classroom, the idea that your worth is in your beauty. Your worth is in, and particularly in tying beauty to traditional standards of beauty, right? Tall, thin, white, blonde beauty. So that has a big impact on girls, and obviously has some intersections with race and also with body image. So girls tell us a lot that it's really, no matter what, they're so smart, they're on these paths to amazing things, and they still need to make sure that they still feel that the most important thing about them socially is how they look and how they present themselves, despite all that. And they might, in some schools, in many schools, they'll talk about even kind of dumbing themselves down in certain contexts because they don't want to be too intimidating, right, to boys. For boys, and we see this play, and the other piece, for girls, is about being a pleaser. Whew. So we see a lot, we talk a lot with girls, we see this, this is in the research literature, but we see it play out, this idea of perfection, like of having to kind of always have it together in terms of how you look, in terms of how you're, interacting with people, and it's this pleaser stance that makes it really hard for girls to get in touch with affirmative consent. Because if I'm always about pleasing someone else and my self-worth is determined by how you respond to me, whether you like me and think I'm likable, if that's really what my self-worth, if you think I'm attractive, then it's going to be very hard for me to negotiate what I really want in a sexual experience, right? So they're kind of set up to have this be a challenging thing. For boys, similarly, boys will talk about, and we again see it play out from the literature, so much pressure to stay in that box and not talk about emotions and only really express anger or frustration, but not show any kind of vulnerability. Always kind of have it together. We see a lot of boys having trouble demonstrating empathy, right? Obviously, boys are just as empathetic as girls. And they're taught by our culture to shut that down. Don't demonstrate too much care. Don't demonstrate too much. If it's a girl that as you get to a certain age, if you're demonstrating too much care and concern for a girl, well, it better be because you're trying eventually to sleep with her, right? So there's much pressure on boys to kind of rein in their natural big emotions and their ability to feel and display empathy. A lot of resistance to that. And then a lot of preoccupation about power in a peer group, right? So we see this really strongly in the literature and also in the schools that we're in. Okay, I'm gonna dive in here for a second because I think it's important for us to set the stage. So what we're really talking about here and where consent education needs to enter is kind of this bottom level here, right? This is a very common, physical kind of representation here of how, kids are talking about rape culture all the time. I don't know in this school how much that is on the minds and language of older students, but certainly in many of the schools we work in, like when we go in the room, there are many young women in probably 8th grade and up that are saying, well, what about rape culture? And they have this language, but not necessarily understanding what that means. The rape culture is the idea that sexual assault, everything we're talking about tonight with this affirmative consent doesn't just happen right out of nowhere. It's not because there's, someone's mentally ill. It's not because someone was, so filled with sexual lust they couldn't control themselves, all these kind of myths that we have, right? Those aren't the reasons why it happens. It happens because we have a culture that allows violence to happen in this way. And that culture starts at that bottom level of normalizing violence against women and girls, and also against anyone that doesn't fit in with the boxes. So gender non-conforming students, students that identify as gay or lesbian, anyone that's not identifying in those boxes, right, is where this bottom level of normalization hits. So locker room banter, anything where a response might be like, boys will be boys. That's a red flag, right? That's the bottom level there. All the things that we dismiss as like, what can you expect, he's a boy? You know, I rejected that before, and I reject it even more now with raising a boy. That boys need to be held to and are very capable of ascending up to the same social and emotional level of development. So we have this normalization happening in our culture all the time, right? All the ways that kind of sexism plays out and heterosexism plays out. And as it goes up and up is when we start to get more towards intense physical manifestations of that. What it really is looking at is the devaluation of women and girls and anyone that's identifying outside of the man box. Right? That's kind of what this is all based on here. So if we're talking about consent, we need to start from a place of why is it so prevalent in our culture to have sex be approached as an unequal thing, right? Girls are not saying like, oh yeah, I'm going into this for my own pleasure. They're saying, yeah, they're hooking up because they want to please this boy, because they don't want him to sleep with someone else, because they want to be cool, right? They're never talking about what they actually want. And boys are like, because they talk about social status all the time, right? Maybe it's because of pleasure, but it's also because they want to be able to brag, right? All of that is wrapped up in this slide here. So, the role of consent education. So with that foundation, consent education, right, starts young. It starts at, birth. I mean, it really starts so young where we are sending some clear messages at every age. And as kids get older, those messages can start to become more about relationships and sexuality, romantic relationships and sexuality. But it's not about sexual behavior for younger children, right? It's about empathy. The biggest challenge that we have in the classroom is the radical idea that two people getting together to do something sexual means that we have to see both of them as equal humans with equal right to say yes, no, maybe, right? The humanity of a sexual experience is so removed for our children overall because we're so objectified, all of us in our culture. So we have to bring that back. Like the foundations of a consent education program need to be about empathy, respect, boundaries, rights, right? These are the things that we need to be reframing for our young people. So some key messages for all ages around consent. You have the right to control your body and boundaries at any time, no matter what, right? No matter what. These are your rights. You can control your body whether you are 3 years old, 13 years old, right? You have a say about who touches you, what you like, what you don't like. And the flip side is always you have to ask permission, right? Because of this history of sexual violence and sexism, a lot of our efforts at consent and at sexual violence prevention are telling girls what they should and shouldn't do, right? So you have the right to say no, don't, as opposed to, we don't, in this family, in this community, right, we always respect someone's boundaries. We always ask someone if it's okay. Playing this out as a parent is hard. I talk about this all the time. I need to practice it. So when I'm home and, when he's being cute, he's cute, my 3-year-old. And, sometimes I'll just look at him and, I just want to give him a kiss and squeeze him. And I'll say, can I give you a kiss? And he says, no, not right now, Mommy. And I'm like, good, right? But I have to respect that. I have to ask him if he feels like it, and I have to respect if he says no. And I'm trying to teach him to do the same for me, right? So we have to practice these things with our children. We have to demonstrate that their bodies are their right. They don't have to give Aunt so-and-so a hug. They don't have to, right, do something that they don't want to do. Besides you and the doctor maybe with you there, no one else can, should be able to touch them in places they don't want to be touched, right? So these are the messages that we need to send. We also need to talk about care and respect with our kids regularly, all ages. Again, whether it's a game of tag, whether it's play fighting, whether it's wrestling, right? Is the person that you're doing that activity with, are they into it? And how do you know? You know by asking. And if they seem like they're not, you stop, right? And we need to show respect all the time, even if you're annoyed at someone. This is a good thing, to be talking about with younger children as they're navigating friendships, right? We want to talk about the idea that even if you're upset with someone, you want to demonstrate respect towards them. What does that look like? We also want to talk about rejection. I talk about this with my 3-year-old a lot. When someone rejects you, it's hard, right? Whether you're a child that's on the playground and saying like, do you want to play with me? Do you want to play tag? Do you want to play, this? And someone says no, right? Or you're an adolescent who is wanting to hook up with someone and you ask them and they say no. Rejection is hard. And many of us, particularly young men, are not raised to handle rejection very well, right? So this is something we need to talk about a lot. It's hard if someone rejects you. We want to normalize it. If someone doesn't want to play with you, if someone, rejects your play date, whatever it is, it's hard. And we have to tolerate it and respect it. How can we help our young people, and how can we show that as well? So some of what you can do, and then I want to open it up for questions here. This is for a little bit for younger children. I wanted to include a bit of a range, right? So we want to, again, teach them to ask permission to touch someone. Some of you have heard my story about the cat. I'll tell it again. But, it's something we work on regularly, which is, we have a cat at home, and my son loves the cat, Rosie. And every morning he wants to give Rosie a hug and some pets. And some mornings, Rosie likes that. She purrs, she rubs into him. Other mornings, Rosie's like, get away from me. I do not want this right now. And we talk almost every morning still about how do you know, you have to ask Rosie. Now, Rosie is a cat, she can't talk, but increasingly he is interpreting her meows, right? And he's getting good at it. So when she gives a meow and nuzzles up to him, I'll say, what do you think Rosie's saying? Oh, I think she likes it. I think she wants to be pet. I'll say, I think so too. And when Rosie meows in a different way and she moves away, I'll say, what do you think Rosie's saying now? Rosie doesn't want to be touched right now, right? And sometimes that's upsetting for him because he wants to pet Rosie and he wants to play with her and he's been looking forward to it. And then we have to talk about that, right? Sometimes he wants to chase the cats now. We don't chase the cats. They are our friends. They are part of this family. When they're running away, we stop, right? And this is over and over again. Now he's 3, but the same idea can apply as children get older, is to really help them look at what is it, how do you know when someone wants to play with you? How do you know when someone's being your friend, right? What are the things that they're showing you? And how do you handle it if they're not? So we want to talk about that. We also, as they're getting older, we want to talk about gender, right? So if you're not kind of actively talking about gender at home, then you want to start doing that. What does it mean if your child identifies as a boy, what does that mean for them in this school, in this culture? What does it mean for you if you identify as a man, right? If your child identifies as a girl, if your child doesn't identify as either gender, you want to open up this conversation and really talk about it. And the more you can get in touch, ultimately, this is really about us, right? This evening is an invitation to you to look at your own gender biases, to look at the moments when you get uncomfortable. If you have a child that identifies as a boy and he is, and he's upset about something or he cries, is there a certain point when you start to feel like, okay, it's enough time, get it together? Is there a certain point when tears are not a certain age where he shouldn't be crying anymore, right? There's a lot of ways that some of this plays out for us. We are not immune, and we can't actually help our kids with it if we don't kind of do our own work. So that's why this modeling is so important for us to really think about what this means for us. And in that vein, we want to set really clear expectations, not just about relationships in real life, but online too, friendships and behavior that happens, right? When we're talking about consent, we're always end up talking in the classroom about online, right? Consent to publish a photo, consent to, anything that's related to online, to post something about someone else. Because that's what consent's about, right? It's about respect and boundaries. And your child, to set the expectation that they don't post a photo of someone or a story about someone without asking them for their consent. It's got to be freely given, so a lot of pressuring around it wouldn't make it freely given. And vice versa. Every child should be asking your child if they're posting anything of them, right? This gets very murky with social media, but those same expectations have to really be there. So I also think there's the why it's important, right? I often say to parents that whatever expectations your children know you have around homework, right, and why it's important that they do their homework or that they study, they need to have just as clear expectations around consent, relationships, friendships, how they should be treating other people, how they should be treated. All of the pieces that whatever particulars your child is involved with or struggling with, what are your expectations for how they will behave and how someone will behave towards them, and why is that important? We want to lay that out just as clearly as the homework thing. Because one of the things also about that we see in the research on affluent communities is that young people assume, they perceive that their parents value achievement, extrinsic kind of successes and motivators much more than intrinsic values like kindness and connectedness and empathy. And part of that is, part of the struggle that we really see in this community of bringing young people back to saying it's not just important, like the competition and the accomplishment and all of that and knowing a lot of things, right? That's great. And what's really important about you, my child, is that you're really empathetic or that you really care about your friends. We want to really call out, point out, and emphasize what's important about our children and what we want for them that has nothing to do with what they accomplish, but just who they are. And that's going to build a foundation for them to approach people from a consensual place. So in terms of school community, there's certainly a lot, and this is just a little bit of some ideas here. But bringing this into the school community means looking at curriculum, means looking at policies, right? We offer an educator a 2-day consent training for educators every fall and every spring. Our next one's actually coming up in a month or so. And we dive into this, right? It's 2 days, so we really get into kind of how all of this shows up in the community from K through 12. And then what do we do? How do we build accountability, right? How do we challenge some of this? How do we build role models in the community who have this framework and can come from this place on a daily basis? So we can challenge some of those boys will be boys attitudes, so we can help girls that are feeling the pressure to sexualize themselves at ever younger ages, right? And really help them to see that their value is not in their sexuality. Look at what pressures they're getting. Okay, so I want to pause. I want to invite you to ask me some questions, to ask each other some questions, kind of thinking about particularly too, like what can we do with this in this community, in the Bank Street community?